Hey everyone, recently I published this game in Dreams called A Little Perspective. A lot of people seemed stumped on how I did this, so I wanted to make a video not just explaining how it works, but the actual steps I took to getting it working. I'm hoping it might be valuable for others who have weird ideas like this but get overwhelmed at just the thought of trying to implement them, and want an example of what breaking down a problem like this might look like. That said, this video might be hard to follow if you're not already an advanced Dreams logic user. I came up with the idea for the game when I was bored at work one day, thinking about the PS3 game echochrome. I'm a programmer, and I was wondering how something so strange like bridging gaps with just your perspective could be programmed. One of the ideas I came up with was to basically simulate your eyesight, raycast from the camera through different positions around the player in order to detect whether or not a floor is visually next to you. I figured you could then mask the motion between those points by teleporting the player across the gap at the correct time as they walk towards the floor being detected. I also realized all the tools required to implement that idea were available in Dreams. So with that somewhat vague idea in mind, I decided to get started after refining the design a bit. To keep things simple, I decided I wanted only 4 possible camera angles instead of a freely rotating camera, and to make the player a cube that stays on the grid. The first thing I implemented was the camera. In order for the idea to work, I needed the camera to always be centered on the player. However, I knew I couldn't attach it directly to the player model because I kind of wanted the player movement animation to involve flipping the cube around. So I attached the camera to an invisible block that followed a tag on the player so I could rotate the player and the camera independently. To make the camera rotate at 90-degree increments, I used 4 teleporters paired with 4 tags at different 90-degree orientations, and then I activated them one by one with the selector passing through 4 smoothing signal manipulators. To get everything to visually line up the way I needed it to, I needed an orthographic camera so that the depth of an object wouldn't affect its apparent size too much. You can't get a perfectly orthographic camera in Dreams as of now, but you can get close by moving the camera really far back and decreasing the field of view as much as possible. This isn't perfect, especially near the edge of the screen, but I found the effect to be close enough as long as I kept the camera centered on the player. With the camera working, it was time to move on to the movement system. I decided to break the player movement problem into 2 parts, detecting spaces that are visually adjacent to you, and then actually moving you to one of those spaces. So first was detection. Like I said earlier, I could basically check if there was something visually in a specific position by pointing laser scopes from the camera past the squares adjacent to the player. You'll notice if I place the cube anywhere on a diagonal like this, it'll always appear to be in the same spot from a certain camera angle. So, to detect a square in an adjacent position to the player, all I needed to do was set up a laser scope that pointed through a diagonal like that, through one of the squares next to the player. I started out using 4 laser scopes, one for each of the possible movement directions. Just detecting whether the laser scopes actually hit something wasn't enough though. I needed to differentiate between floors and walls. To do this, I needed to make sure the surface the laser scope was hitting was facing up. This would indicate that it was hitting a floor, whereas any other surface direction meant it was hitting a wall. I first did this by doing this, but then I eventually optimized it to this, after figuring out a fancy way to check unit vector equality with just a single signal manipulator. I don't want to go too deeply into how that works though, or I'll start going way off topic. Anyway, point is, if the laser scope hit orientation equaled the up vector, that meant it was hitting a floor that you could stand on. I also needed to make sure the laser wasn't detecting a space closer to the camera than the player if you were actually trying to move away from the camera, or vice versa. For example, if I put a block here, this is in line with the laser scope that checks for an up-left move, but it'd end up looking really weird if an up-left move got you onto this block. So to prevent this, I just compared the hit distance of the laser scope with the hit distance of another laser scope pointing straight at the player itself. There was an edge case that came up here as well. When trying to move towards the camera, I realized half the target block could be blocked by a wall, which would cause the check to fail. If I made the laser scope point here, it could be blocked by a block setup like this. If I move the laser scope over here, it could still fail due to a block covering this half. So I actually needed 2 laser scopes for each of the front side movement directions to check if either half of the floor was visible. Now, what if neither half was visible? This was when I discovered that spaces hidden completely by pillars or even the player itself would fail to be detected. At first I thought maybe this is a bug I need to fix, but then I realized it was consistent with the core idea of the game, being you can only move to spaces that appear to be next to you. If a space isn't visible in the first place, who's to say you can move to it, let alone whether or not it exists? So I kept that in. This also made me realize I only needed 1 laser scope for each of the away from camera movement directions, because no matter what, the player model would always be blocking half of the square you'd be trying to move to. In testing this setup, I found a few other weird edge cases. For example, this setup. This square actually satisfies all the checks I mentioned before. The vertical hit orientation, the position relative to the player, and the hit distance all indicate that the player could move down and left to this square. But this doesn't look like a square that the player should be able to move to from here. Why is that? Well, the entire target square is visible, but half the front of the player is blocked, so movement towards the camera doesn't really make sense. So I had to add 2 more laser scopes to check for visibility of the front of the player to fix this edge case. This actually led to another originally unplanned game mechanic. If the player itself wasn't visible, certain visible squares wouldn't be detected as valid moves. Again, at first I thought this was a bug, but I realized this is consistent with the game as well because, again, if you can't see the player, how can you be sure it exists? This was both a cool, almost humorous mechanic to add, as well as a way of preventing some weird moves that would have appeared broken. So I added several more laser scopes to check for player visibility, 6 in total, and I disabled movement if all of those laser scopes did not hit the player. So I can detect spaces you can move to, cool. Now I needed a way to actually move you to those squares. Just moving the player 1 grid space in the direction they're trying to go wasn't going to work most of the time, obviously. So to get the exact location to move to, I could use the laser scopes from the previous step, since they have a hit location output. To keep things grid aligned, I made sure all of the floors in the levels were centered on whole number coordinates. Then I could just use a calculator to round the laser scope hit location, which would give me the location of the center of the detected floor square. To make my life simpler, I decided not to think about the smooth animation yet at this point, and to just go with teleporters to get the player to the space. There's no way to feed a location directly into a teleporter, so I needed to instead feed it into an emitter that spawns a tag that the player was set to teleport to. That seemed to work pretty well. With that working, and after playing around a bit and realizing how promising the gameplay already felt, I needed to focus on smoother movement. I realized I could pull this off while still using the teleporter. I could do this using 2 different methods, depending on whether you're moving towards or away from the camera. If you're moving away from the camera, which would always be onto a space below or even with the starting position, I could animate the cube rolling off the space, then teleport the player to the target location at the end of the animation, which would snap the animation back to the player's center the moment the teleport happens. This created the illusion of the player smoothly rolling to the target space. You can see this in action more clearly if I make the top of the cube a different color. For moving towards the camera onto a space that's even or higher up, I had to do the opposite. Teleport first and simultaneously start an animation of the player rolling onto the target space rather than off of the starting space. Now, this does still have a few weird visual artifacts in some situations where the player is partially blocked by a wall, and I haven't quite figured out how to elegantly fix them, but I felt it was close enough in most cases that I decided to live with it. At this point, things started to seem pretty promising. I was satisfied with the outcome. That is, until someone made a suggestion in my chat while I was streaming. We had a third dimension rotation, so you can go up and down walls. Probably not. Well, would it work? Spoiler alert, I did end up implementing that idea, but this video will be way too long if I go into that. If people really want me to, I can make another detailed video about that endgame mechanic, but the high level idea is pretty similar. It just comes with a few extra gotchas and required some tricky optimizations. Just let me know. Anyway, I hope you found this video helpful. Go play a little perspective, and thanks for watching.